Hello, and welcome back to the University of Guelph Debate Club podcast. I've been a student of Professor Goldenberg's for a while now, taking her Philosophy of Medicine course and Feminist Philosophy course. I learned so much about medicine and about the feminist perspective. Today we'll be talking about vaccine hesitancy, the feminist critique of epistemology regarding science, and also, is science objective or is it rather value-laden? When watching this episode, I really want you to pay attention to how much feminism has shifted my perspective through every single course I took in university. It helped me be more rigorous with understanding the different perspectives that I learned in my science courses and how I use that philosophy courses, specifically my feminist of philosophy background, to really be critical and scrutinize the perspective I'm learning from and to make the knowledge I gain more practical and useful within real life settings. I hope you like this episode, and I can't wait for the many more to come. Your book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, reframes the problem of vaccine skepticism. You argue it's not a lack of understanding, but a crisis of trust. Why is this distinction so important, and how does it change how we respond to public health challenges like COVID-19 or misinformation online?
Thank you for that question, George. So that view that I argue against, that vaccine hesitancy is a reflection of lack of understanding of science by the public, is the common view. And I challenged it by arguing that instead, vaccine hesitancy reflects this broader crisis of trust. So trust in institutions, in government, in the scientific establishment. And what that means is that outreach is misguided because we are building most vaccine outreach, so that's communications to the public, based on this assumption that there's missing scientific evidence, that that's what's holding people back from embracing vaccines and getting themselves and their children vaccinated. So what I'm arguing is that simply providing more scientific data or trying to educate vaccine hesitant individuals by showing them the studies, the numbers, that kind of thing, it often fails because the actual concerns of your audience are actually rooted in mistrust and not ignorance of the scientific consensus on vaccines. So for many people, the issue is not whether or not the experts think vaccines work, but whether those expert entities promoting vaccines actually can be trusted to act in the public's best interest. Because, just to be clear, it's because those entities produce the scientific evidence, there is the possibility, at least people are thinking about this, that there is some kind of nefarious intent, as well as some kind of skill that you can create false or misleading evidence. And that might be what what we're seeing here when we hear from the experts that vaccines are something we should do. So if that's true, so imagine you believe this, that there might be some kind of nefarious intent there, then any evidence favoring the vaccines and even education efforts trying to teach people to accept those findings will not be trusted. So that is significant for how we talk to the public and think about vaccine research. So how we talk about and think about vaccine uptake. So most of the vaccine health promotion literature, the kind of things you see like infographics online or the signs you might have seen on subway and bus station billboardings, follow this kind of educational model of here's the facts about vaccines, and sometimes there's even the accompanying don't believe the myths about vaccines. So it is assuming when I give you the list of here's the facts, this is why you should get the flu vaccines, this is what we know about it, that's all you need to know. It assumes that the public just needs a little more education, an opportunity to fill in what might be called a knowledge gap. And once they do that, they'll support vaccination and they'll get vaccinated. Now, against that view, there's a lot of health research, sort of health research into the psychology of decision-making and compliance with all kinds of health recommendations, telling us that people understand the messaging just fine. Whether they follow that imperative gets a lot more complicated because people bring in other things than their understanding of the evidence, things like past experience with healthcare systems, all kinds of affective issues like how they feel about healthcare recommendations. Do they trust public health? What do their parents say? What does their community say? So there's a lot more to it than filling us in with the facts. I'm sorry, the last question you had asked was how would that change how we respond to public health challenges like COVID-19? So COVID vaccine outreach, I'll speak to the Canadian context, was at least for a while quite rigorous. We were hearing health promotion messaging on getting the COVID vaccine quite a lot. But they used that kind of here's the facts, don't believe the myth framing that I just described before. So if you think back to the kind of things you might have seen, it was usually an advertisement was something like get the facts about COVID vaccines, and there'd be a column of facts next to a column of myths, usually check marks next to all the factual claims and X's next to the myths. And it would write things like COVID vaccines were rigorously tested prior to being licensed, and there'd be a check mark next to that. And it would be next to the myth. COVID vaccines are an experimental vaccine that have not been properly tested. So it would look like that, sort of the yes/no binary. And as public stress was heightened and all these questionable claims came about sort of about vaccines, this fact versus myth response wasn't really speaking to the fear, the confusion about vaccines, and the kind of distrust people were feeling about all kinds of expert institutions because we were going through a hard time. So people were looking for something to sort of assuage that fear, not a here's the facts kind of educational effort. And what would have worked better was some kind of something certainly more conversational, probably not captured in an infographic, but something that was more attentive to the concerns and misgivings people had, and messaging that encouraged pro-social and health-seeking behaviors that could include vaccines.
Thinking back, yeah, that because it did kind of backfire if we see now, not to get too into the political mindset, but it does really reinstituting some biases that they had COVID-19, especially with the vaccine mandate and how even the method they were using, that didn't really help the distrust between the people. And it was just like, oh, you're putting the facts, but these people got even more angry with the facts. Like, yeah, no, look how much they're pushing this. This is not supposed to happen. This it should be a different way. So it was interesting how it acted like a negative reinforcement. I wanted to ask, what would then be kind of a possible solution? Would it be like kind of like workshops between like public health officials and the people within the public to get to know more about the doctors rather than the vaccine itself?
Yeah, were actually some examples of very successful efforts. They were town hall meetings, but they were held virtually just because this was during COVID. And it was town hall meetings that were inviting certain communities or certain groups, often groups that were identified as being very hesitant about vaccines. So I'll give you an example, something that happened online, but it was based in Toronto, but it was done online, was a group called Canadian Black Scientists and Doctors held a town hall, advertised it, invited anyone could come, and they gave messaging around the COVID vaccines and answered questions that had been sent in advance. And I attended that. I identified myself as not part of the community, but interested to hear what they had to say. And I listened to the speakers, first of all, were members of that community. And that seems to be important for communications. It's not just what you say. You also have to have some kind of trust towards the speaker, and seeing expert speakers that understand your background and share some of your background, community and heritage seems to go a long way. That's kind of known from communications research. And also the speakers were quite sensitive to attending to the concerns of the community. So they would say things like, I know that the health community, that healthcare in Canada has often mistreated us as a community. So they could acknowledge the history of healthcare racism in Canada and the kind of injustices that have been experienced by Black Canadians. But they could say, even with that in mind, this vaccine is the best thing for our community, and here's why. And they spoke about the vulnerabilities specific to this community. It was often due to precarious work arrangements or crowded housing conditions. And they said, this is exactly why you need the vaccine, and this is why you shouldn't turn away from it just because you've got all kinds of negative feelings about your current circumstances and perhaps your historic relationship with the healthcare system. So, and this was tracked over time. They were watching how different ethnic groups in Canada were responding to polls about will you get vaccinated? How do you? And they said there was a shift that was happening earlier on in the pandemic, even before the vaccines appeared. It had been noticed that a lot of racialized groups were wary of the vaccines. Most said, I'm likely not to get the vaccine when it becomes available. When the vaccine was introduced, the numbers were still lower, but it seemed like efforts like this one shifted the dial on it. And we got to a point where many ethnic groups were comparable to the comparison group was sort of white European Canadians who have been in Canada for a long time. It started to look more equal, except for a couple of minority groups that were outliers, and they obviously needed more care and more attention. But the point was speaking to the community, hearing the messaging from people that know your history and share your history actually made a difference.
I was thinking about where do you think kind of this focus on the facts is kept so like tight knit? Like where do you think kind of the communication network? Because I know there's the doctors and then there's the public health officials and then there's also the government that they all three have to work together and sometimes the doctors want to say something that the government really doesn't understand, so they go with a different route that the public health officials know how to explain to the government. Why do you think it's such a fixation with the facts rather than like the communication?
That's a good question. One and an interesting question too. It speaks a little bit to political communications where there's been this tendency over the last number of over, I'm going to say since around the 1990s, and I'll speak to what happened then, where politicians started using the language of evidence-based. Of course, this is something that came from medicine, evidence-based medicine, and it morphed into other areas of research and practice, including political speech and policy making. And it was decided that one way to avoid a lot of political division was to use science and just say, here are the facts. And it's a way of sort of taking responsibility away from the politicians from making decisions that might be unpopular, at least by some people, because you rarely make decisions that please everyone, and saying, it's not me, I'm just following the science. So you heard that a lot during COVID. We're following the science, and it's a way of saying, I'm being objective, I'm not letting my politics get in, and therefore everyone should agree with me, right? And you only need to take a few classes in philosophy of science to realize that that's not an authentic view. Saying I'm following the science can allow you to do a lot of things, because science rarely narrows in on one focused conclusion, and certainly doesn't narrow in on what we do with that conclusion in the political realm. So there was a bit of a struggle sometimes between the doctors, the public health officials, and the government to try to say, no, I've got the facts, instead of admitting that we've actually got a value conflict here that requires political means, not just here's my paper, here's your paper, here's my expert, here's your expert.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I'll go on to the next question then. You often emphasize that science is not value free. Can you unpack what that means for people who may believe science is objective? By definition, how can acknowledging the role of values in science help rebuild trust without undermining credibility?
Okay, very good question, and actually a big question for health communication. So I'll start with this with what it means when philosophers of science say that science is not value free. And pretty much all philosophers of science say this. And when they say that, they mean that science is influenced by human values at various stages in the scientific process. So that perspective, this idea that science is not value free, it really challenges the common view of science that science is entirely objective. By objective, we usually mean something like science is not affected by social, cultural, political, or ethical considerations. And the philosophers like me come around and say that's actually not true. Because, and I'll sort of review, there's like a number of ways that values are introduced into scientific reasoning. And I'm going to sort of outline them quickly, but then I'll just, and this is all to say that it is inescapable. These kind of values enter into scientific reasoning, whether you want to call science objective or not. So the first one is values will for sure enter what questions get researched and of course what questions get funded. So scientists get to choose the questions they investigate, and they choose them based on perceived societal needs, based on funding priorities, you know, what's going to get funded, or based on sort of cultural interests. So to give an example, research into renewable energy might be driven by environmental values. Otherwise, we may not be interested in renewable energy. I'll give you another example. Just over the weekend, there was this CBC article. So it came out on Saturday. So this would have been on May 10th. There was this CBC article that I read raising alarm about how low priority women's health research is in Canada. So the article started with this alarming data that only 6% of federal medical research grants that had been awarded between like 2012 to 2023, so an 11-year period, by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research were dedicated to women's health research. And from those 6% of grants given to women's health research projects, they were almost exclusively reproductive and gynecological health, which means a whole slate of other conditions that present differently in women, like pain, mental health, cardiac disease. Those issues barely get touched. So that's an example of values entering, because it seems that, at least in this case, some problematic values are influencing what kind of medical research is seen important enough to be funded by federal dollars and therefore researched in Canadian healthcare. Okay. Another place where values enter is in the method. So once we have our research questions, how do we go about answering it? And the methods you pick are going to reflexively frame the question a little bit differently. For example, you'll recharacterize the question a little bit if you decide that it's something that should be answered quantitatively, or whether it should be answered qualitatively. In medical research, other types of values enter into our methodology. Like, we need to make decisions about what is the acceptable level of uncertainty or risk that is allowable within our conclusions. And that involves value judgments. I'll give an example for that. So like in public health, we might be doing research into determining the safety of a vaccine. And doing that requires that we do some balancing of statistical risks, but also ethical considerations of public well-being. For example, we need to decide what chance of adverse events from vaccines do we consider tolerable? And there's that number, but also how serious can those negative side effects from vaccines be? So there is no scientific answer to that question. Instead, it's a value question about risk tolerance. What kind of risk do we think is permissible given all kinds of socially constructed outcomes that we desire, things like a healthy population? Okay. So what was that? That was values in methodology. Values also enter our interpretation of the data. So once I've done my trial, once I've got my data, then I need to interpret it in order to draw any kind of meaningful conclusions, because numbers don't speak for themselves. And that interpretation can be influenced by all kinds of implicit biases or broader societal values. So there's lots of histories of medical research showing how experimental findings often reflected sexist or racial biases that were sort of common at the time. And of course, scientists thought they were removed from society, but scientists are people too, and they were bringing all kinds of ideas from the time, let's say about women being weak or about other races being inferior to Europeans. And that was actually influencing how they interpreted the data. And I'd also like to say it is still happening today. There are some good ideas about how to address those social biases in the interpretation of data, but no scientist should feel comfortable that we're done with all the social biases and we don't do it anymore. Okay, the next part after the values in interpreting data would be how we apply the application of scientific discoveries into the world. So that's probably more obvious than some of the other value considerations I just said. If we're going to, let's say, use nuclear energy to heat our homes or experiment with genetic engineering to let's say feed the world, there are all kinds of ethical and social values that we need to think about how we use the technologies and what kind of risks are we willing to grant, especially if the outcomes are projected to be really good. So this is all to say that science reflects its context, and the context where science operates is full of values. Science is conducted, by people that are embedded in all kinds of cultural and historical contexts, and this affects not just which questions are seen as important, but what methods are developed, how the results are interpreted, and finally how they are communicated. So that's a long way of saying science is not value three, there's values all the way through. The last thing, I know we're going to move on to another question, but an important thing to keep in mind is philosophers of science do not conclude, now that we've, opened the, let all the value genies out of the bottle, they do not conclude that that means science is just, relative to social whims. In fact, science can still be rigorous and objective, even if we allow that values enter into science, okay?
I think that's true. That's so much so that I'm going into wanting to learn more about it. So
I know you are. So, you took the philosophy of science class with me, the feminist philosophy of science class, and you heard that argument. You saw examples of it, and now you're taking it further. I'm glad you are. It's an important message. It's got a lot of practical importance. It certainly informs my thinking about vaccines and about all kinds of philosophy of medicine ideas that this idea that we can somehow have some kind of objective value-free science is not tenable. In fact, it can obscure all kinds of biases that we should be paying attention to. So instead, being honest about it can actually lead to better science. I think there's actually a good message that comes out of that.
most definitely. Many students studying science are taught to follow the evidence, yet your work suggests evidence alone isn't always enough. What would you say to young scientists or health professionals about integrating ethical reflection and public responsibility into their work?
Oh, what a good question. Thank you for asking that. So yes, scientists are trained to follow the evidence. That is what scientists are taught to do, but not so much trained to be reflective about the values that go into their work. So we just talked about those areas where values can enter into scientific work. And scientists ought to be cognizant of that as they're doing that kind of work. And by cognizant, I mean, first of all, noticing that it's there, asking themselves, what kind of values are influencing my work, my focus, my interpretation of the data. And once we do that, we can scrutinize those values the same way we scrutinize our methods, our data, and the interpretation of the data. So this question that you asked me, it's certainly about asking about the kind of methods that scientists should be using, but it also might be, you might be hinting at the worry that some scientists have when they are working in areas of science that are more politically hot, like climate science, for example. They might be wondering, like, what can we do about public pushback and even political demonstration against the kind of work that we do. So to that, I would say that the public pushes back against science when they perceive the scientific work to be reflecting or endorsing values that the rest of us don't share. So for example, if big pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, is perceived as putting profits ahead of public safety and well-being, well, that's a values conflict, and that's something that's worthy of attention. People in general want to be safe. They want safe and effective, and of course, affordable drugs. It's not that they're against the industry being profitable, but it shouldn't be at the expense of those public goods, by which I mean safety and effectiveness and accessibility. So scientific organizations that our scientists, our hypothetical young scientists work for, could do well by keeping their values in check in a few ways. They can do things like have ethics consultations at every stage of the research development. It's also helpful to employ scientists from different backgrounds and life experiences to bring more diverse viewpoints that challenge conventional thinking, including value considerations. Some scientific projects can and already do, but should even do more community consultation, giving the public who will be impacted by the work an opportunity to bring in their own experiential expertise. I'm thinking of public health, which sometimes does this. Let's say they want a public health unit wants to go into an underserved neighborhood to do, let's say, I don't know, a nutritional intervention or something like that. The smartest thing you can do is get community members on your board to figure out what kind of research is useful to the community, what is the way to do it that the community would actually be willing to participate. So to that, I'm saying, so that what I just described there is kind of like a diversity, equity, and integration initiative, which of course is right now getting a lot of negative press in the current political climate. But in fact, this kind of inclusion has long been seen as a way of making science more critical, more rigorous, and overall we get better science.
I'm reminded of the class, I forgot the course code, but Philosophy of Medicine, where that class is basically to engage the future healthcare workers to understand this perspective and to understand how to integrate this within their future line of work.
And your question was kind of the same version of that question for scientists. And scientists should be thinking about their not just their values in order to be self-critical, which is helpful. It is actually good to be self-critical and think about, have I, am I seeing all my biases? It's very hard to see our biases. Are there other perspectives that I'm not considering? But also scientific organizations should be doing the same. Are we doing enough being explicit about our values, consulting the public? Are we doing the work we need to do in order for the public to trust the work that we do? And that's important for scientists, unless you're working in a really obscure area of science that the public doesn't care about. But most of the science that we hear about in the news is not of that sort. If you're talking about health or environment or anything around welfare, you need to be looking at all the stakeholders, including the public. And because of that, you need to be looking at how values play into the scientific research and the uptake of that research.
Knowing that science is just much more everlasting than political careers or wherever government functions. These programs that last for like diversity and equity, like these things that we would have proposed by government or anything of the sorts, even if the government doesn't necessarily promote these things to be something that is by a governing body, it's still possible to do these diversity equity just by your own work and by your how you treat your lab or how you treat your lab work, right? It's more than just having someone tell you to do it, but you can actively make the change as well.
Yeah.
You've contributed extensively to feminist critiques of evidence-based medicine. How can feminist epistemology reshape how we understand good evidence in healthcare? And what insights does it offer about the power dynamics between patients, doctors, and the institutions that govern both?
That's a good question. So, okay, there's a few parts, so I'll try to answer. If I miss anything, you have to tell me, okay? But so your question right away, it actually takes us back to the values and science question that we discussed already. But so you asked a question about what counts as good evidence in healthcare, which is an important question, and it was brought to the forefront of both medical practice, and then as a result of that, philosophy of medicine with the introduction of evidence-based medicine. It was called, at the time when it was introduced in the 1990s, it was this new paradigm of medicine, a new paradigm of academic medicine that wanted to rid clinical medicine of all of its appeals to hunches, traditions, clinical experience, and this is how we've always done medicine. And this type of reasoning was apparently prevalent among physicians when they were thinking through, what do we do with this patient? How do we diagnose them? What's their prognosis? Certainly, how do we treat them? So in came evidence-based medicine and said, no more of all that anecdotal, non-scientific stuff. Let's put everything to the test, preferably a randomized controlled trial. So that's evidence-based medicine. Evidence from randomized controlled trials, preferably. There's lesser forms of evidence if you can't find that, but definitely privilege, RCT evidence, and that is what should be directing medical practice. A medical practice needs to be responsive to the most reliable and current scientific literature. And and clinicians love that idea. Well, some said, haven't we been doing evidence-based medicine all along? Others said, you're right, more rigorous, more up-to-date, scientifically informed medicine has got to be a good thing. So largely treated as a good thing, people wanted to get involved, but it didn't take very long for some clinicians to admit that there isn't a randomized controlled trial for every clinical question. And sometimes the qualitative features of the specific case will give physicians good reason to think that following the trial evidence is not the best not the best option for this patient or for patients in this clinical setting, just because the practical on the ground case was different enough from the kind of structured trial setup that you would have. Let's say if you're, running a trial in an academic hospital in downtown Toronto versus me working in a small clinic in rural Ontario, that kind of thing. So what I just said there really takes us back to values in science, the values that shape the context or the circumstance that seems to need more interpretation than what does the trial say. It's those values that just keep seeping through, and we can't seem to get away from it. So that acknowledgement led some clinicians to despair. And you'd occasionally read these opinion articles in medical journals by clinicians who would pick up a little nugget of philosophy of science, like they might invoke Popper's writing on the fallibility of science or under determination of the evidence, otherwise known as the Quine-Duham thesis. So they point to that, and then they'd lament that I guess we can't call anything evidence, in the sense that, oh, by what I mean we can't call anything evidence is in the sense of trial data that's been interpreted judiciously and can inform clinical practice objectively. Okay, so they said, what can we do? There's no such thing as evidence-based medicine. So in comes feminist epistemology here to offer what I think of, and many others do, a really rich philosophical set of resources for explaining how it is that we can acknowledge values in science, scrutinize them, and not fall into this kind of relativistic idea that I guess science can't tell us anything. So the arguments coming out of feminist theory was feminist philosophy of science, I should say, was that science can still be instructive, and science is even better when we acknowledge the values that are informing our scientific understandings. And more than anything, we can subject those values to the same scrutiny that a scientist would subject their data to. So it would take me too long to explain exactly how those feminist interventions work, but they are interesting. And I did actually write a paper on that issue that if people are interested, they can read. It came out, it is called How Can Feminist Theories of Evidence Assist Clinical Reasoning? And authored by me, and it was published in a journal called Social Epistemology in 2013. And I think it answers some of those questions. Okay, I need to pause because your question had another part. It was about power dynamics between patients, doctors, and institutions that govern both. And again, I'm going to talk to you about how values enter into it. When we try to claim that science can be value-free, that medicine can be value-free, which is what evidence-based medicine was trying to do, at least initially. They had to soften their claims because after a while, because it wasn't working. It wasn't a workable idea. They are, whether intended or not, they are obscuring all the kinds of values that enter that will at times allow for doctors and patients and institutions to work together and to agree on things, but sometimes it will pull them apart. The scientific evidence will reflect the values of the scientists who are doing the research and will likely also reflect the values of the practitioners just because they come from sort of similar interests and similar backgrounds. What it will often not do is put the interests of the patients up front because they'll decide what the patient needs. You know, scientific research that is trying to, let's say, heal a patient of an illness is certainly good for patients. But there are instances as medicine where what I consider the best interest of the patient and what you consider the best interest of the patient to be different. I'm assuming I'm the patient and you're the practitioner. So one thing that evidence-based medicine didn't do was properly consider the values of the patients. Later on, they sort of redescribed their program and said, we must also include the values of the patient. So for example, if I'm recommending surgery to you and you don't want surgery, it's actually the patient that gets to decide, not me, even if I know that surgery is likely to give the best outcome. Evidence-based medicine did not, however, give a sort of give a good articulation of how do we introduce it. You know, if RCT, randomized controlled trial evidence is the best, and we also need to bring in patients' considerations, how do those work? Does one override the other? Is there a hierarchy of need here? They're a little bit quiet on that. Okay, so I'm saying all the values need to be put out on the table and explicit, including the values of the patients, the practitioners, and the institutions, because they might cohere, but there are times when they don't, and it's good to be explicit about that.
That's awesome. I was thinking about when you said the when you said about the patient's values, I was then reminded heavily kind of why how important then law is and how that kind of enforces a little bit these philosophical notions into practicality, specifically to hold the doctor even to a better standard, to say like, hey, you didn't follow, did you follow this procedure? You're in a time of stress, but and I know sometimes there's a lot of times that people feel this as like a a lot of pressure, especially when you're just working and you have long hours and you're in the hospital, you're dealing with a lot of patients, and bam, a patient pops up, something very unique after a long day, and then you have to be held accountable. And I think it's very important. We talk about these things and we make it visible to everyone. I'd say because discussions like this are very helpful. I'd assume as going into especially healthcare, you want to know these things, and a lot of people don't talk about like when you go into healthcare that it's a lot of also policy managing. There's a lot of
understanding law. There's a lot of understanding interpersonal communication. A lot of that is kind of flushed out in undergrad, unfortunately. There's the off courses, but I don't know. My personal experience, just having organic chemistry, having human kinetics, all these courses don't really talk about how to deal in stressful situations, other than going to exams and maybe I passed or maybe I didn't.
I think that kind of stuff, the kind of soft skills, I guess we'd call it, to be a good practitioner, well, it ought to be trained up in medical school. And at least I have at least reasonable evidence from what I've heard, they keep modifying all the kind of interview processes that medical schools do when they do the kind of interview questions are usually questions about ethics and what do you do here and how would you say this? So they'll even test people, incoming students, on what kind of bedside manner they've got and the like. Whether they've actually been trained to do it, the answer is probably no. So some people are going to show a natural affinity and some won't. And then what happens in medical school is not always clear because, we don't only want to take in the people that seem to have some kind of natural inclination for it. We also want to cultivate that into really good communication skills and
Mhm.
ethical reasoning.
That I didn't write a question about this, but it popped into my mind, the Casper, especially the Casper section within the medical exams with the MCAT and also having to do the Casper. It's very interesting because I remember we had a seminar on someone who is going into veterinary college and was talking to us about the tricks of how to do the Casper because it's their kind of test of morality, right? To understand what you would you do in this scenario, what are your steps? And it was really interesting to see how the Casper method was kind of dissected into understanding how to score the highest points ethically in a scenario to the point where you would see these methods and you're like, isn't this quite robotic? Is this not, where's the personalized approach to these ethical dilemmas? Because that's what's really important as a doctor, using your unique personalized approach in an ethical way. So yeah, it reminded me.
It sounds a little bit like debate format, which, there's I think highly of debate. I know you do too, George, but sometimes there is a way of doing it that's point scoring rather than,
Mhm.
trying to get to the best solution or something like that.
Mhm. In an age of misinformation, science denial, and polarized public discourse, how should experts communicate uncertainty without losing public confidence? What does epistemic humility look like in practice, and does the public really want it?
There is social science research that suggests people in leadership positions really underestimate how much uncertainty the public can handle. So there's this tug at people in power that they feel the need to say, everything's fine, we got this, no problems here. The other version would be, let's say you're trying to address the nation about a new pandemic level disease that the world didn't know about until a few months ago. Just a hypothetical scenario. The other version would be where you say, this is what we know so far. This is what we think the best approach is. We will keep monitoring the situation. Here are the steps along the way. And that actually works. And whether people want to buy what I said about the social science research saying that, I think you can also try to infer this from the conversations we have with a lot of people in our lives. When we often trust people more when they admit that there are gaps in the knowledge. It means that they're being critical about what they know and what they don't know. And when they can come up with a plan, we'll take this step forward. And if this happens, we'll go in this direction. And if it doesn't happen, we'll go in that direction instead. That's someone who's thinking through all of the scenarios. That's building a strategy instead of overstating your confidence. And I think there's a lot of arguments that people in leadership, even in moments of crisis, can do that and not just assume everyone's going to just absolutely lose it. Now, there are historical examples to counter my view where when people say something and the public just goes wild, riots, that kind of thing, which certainly we don't want. But I think if you unpack some of those examples, you'd see that it's because the public have been disappointed by the messaging they've gotten so far. So, for example, if I'm a leader of a nation and I insist that there's no risk, everything's fine, we've got this, I'm imagining a COVID type of scenario. And then what I predicted doesn't happen, people lose their confidence in the leadership. So just say, everyone stay at home, we'll be out of there in 2 weeks, right? Shelter in place for 2 weeks. Maybe you remember hearing that message. And then 2 weeks later, nothing had happened. And then another 2 weeks later, still we had COVID. And that's when people start to get frustrated. They start to look for alternative ways to understand the problem. They look for alternative experts as well. It's because there wasn't that sort of upfront what gets called epistemic humility. Admit what you know and don't overstate what you don't know, because people will see through that eventually, and it might even make it worse. It will probably make it worse.
I've seen that a lot, especially since after COVID, the boom of a lot of online experts or people who aren't subjected to very rigorous training, like how someone in the medical field would be. The truth really lies within kind of the eye of the beholder now. Kind of like the technology is based on there's a money aspect. There's like how much views can we get? How many people can we influence with this? It's no longer something that how can we treat ethically. Say after I took philosophy of medicine course, I took the ethics course with Professor Davantari, an awesome course, where I read something that came kind of like a glove from the philosophy of medicine course. It was, I forgot what article, but it was an article that was talking about how other, developing nations were treated in COVID time and how vaccine rollout was happening. And I specifically remember a quote from that was talking about how Canada, US, these very bountiful, economically powerful countries said, after we're done using the vaccines, then we will then ship those out to developing nations, the rest that we have. And it shows the ethical and, that the distrust reinforces even more in a time of crisis. You treat us like this.
Yeah, that was good reason for cynicism at the time, the way vaccines were rolled out to people in the global south during COVID. It really showed, I mean, it showed what some people, what cynical people had suspected all along, that there isn't really shared concern for humanity. And it was shown in that example of what's now called euphemistically, it's called vaccine diplomacy. Like, okay, I'll give you my extra vaccines if, right, if you do that kind of thing. It was a poor moment for sort of cohesion and solidarity during a crisis.
There was also a course I took last semester, Epidemiology, which again fit like a glove with philosophy of medicine because it gave me that scope of we were talking a lot about infectious diseases and how vaccines were made and how that happened. And it was interesting to see kind of they talked a little bit about COVID-19, but it wasn't a book that was written I'm pretty sure after the pandemic. It was still before, and it was talking about COVID strains, and I think it's very refreshing, and a lot of people, I think outside of the space that you're not possible to have this resource because it's contained within a university setting, how open the evidence is of just talking about, yeah, no, COVID-19 has been something we've been monitoring for a very long time. It's been happening in these different places, seeing how like even masks were something that was introduced way before than something, and you see the track history of it. And I think a lot of people wouldn't, I don't necessarily say, I 100% agree. It's a lot about the public trust. I even feel sometimes that when I go to the doctor's office, I just don't feel a connection with my doctor. And it's not the best feeling, it's
Yeah.
not. A crucial piece of connection is just not being there.
Yeah, I pity the doctors. They are, overworked and underfunded. Like, my doctor is trying to push me out the door, and I feel that too. And it wasn't always like that, but that's now, I think there's too much strain on physicians. Just, you bleed a system of funding for a long time, it looks like this.
That's so true. Looking forward, how do you envision the role of philosophers, ethicists, and interdisciplinary thinkers in public health. What kind of conversations and collaborations do we need of right now?
I'm a big promoter of interdisciplinary research and certainly the presence of the humanities to be part of health research. We saw during COVID, we had these expert panels that were giving all kinds of advice on whether we should whether we should close schools, whether we should how we should roll out the vaccines. Is it by age? Is it by need? That kind of thing. And these expert panels were always very impressive and very interesting scientists with all kind of credentials. But many of the questions they were trying to answer were much more fitting for the social sciences and even humanities researchers. So, I can speak specifically to how vaccine rollout happened in Canada, mistakes that were made along the way that created all kinds of public anxiety and confusion, that if you'd only asked a vaccine hesitancy researcher, we could have told you this was going to happen because we've seen it before. Historians are especially good at that. Or they'll be like, yeah, you know how history repeats itself? There you go. So a historian of medicine could be helpful for that kind of thing. So, the questions that the questions that are often asked about like what to do for public health, these are fundamentally scientific questions. Public health, of course, is an interdiscipline in itself, but it brings in all kinds of scientists. But the questions are so rooted in culture, and culture is understood by social scientists and certainly by humanities scholars who, it sounds lofty when we say we study the human condition, but it means that we actually understand where our ideas come from and how our ideas track over time. So I would love to see more genuinely interdisciplinary public health that includes social scientists and includes non-scientists like humanities. I would love to see that. I think it would change conversations, and there would have, at least when I look back at COVID vaccine rollout, would have been less stumbling along the way, because we all have something to contribute to complex problems, and to try to silo it as a science question or just these scientists but not these scientists, the limits become apparent very, very quickly.
I wanted to say, because you were talking a lot about public distrust, and last semester I also was in a class with Professor DeVoe, Debates in Political Science. And what it helped me kind of scope in, because of course every philosopher is going to have one area of niche that they're going to want to think that this is the right answer that's going to solve all the problems. I think, at least I'm a person who really likes to fix it on something and say, oh, this is one solution to the problem, and then there's hundreds of different more perspectives on how to solve this problem. I saw a possible like anecdotal example of how I see this distrust not even just form in a young age is honestly with academia. And every time I get to talk about it, I really do emphasize it, specifically the de-streaming or the streaming that happens within Ontario. It's not the solution to every single province, because every single province has their own way of handling it. But you see from a young age that, especially like the education system, kind of separates classes and groups of people towards academic or applied, which it does a certain thing that I've seen. It implies that the applied individuals are not as rigorously intellectual as the academic students, hence implying that the applied work is like engineers, police officers, firefighters, factory workers. These people are not as academically inclined as the academic seeking learners. And even in high school, it limits then them to go into physics courses or biology courses or all these different courses. So I think we have this kind of like separating different people into classes, even from such a young age within our system. That really is a very old system that comes from, very shady ethical decisions. So I think just when you were talking about that, that really a little bit to me goes hand in hand, because I would assume sometimes some people may have wanted to go into healthcare or may have wanted to learn more about these things. But even from a young age, you're limited to attain that just based on economic barriers. I don't think that's fair. I wanted to bring it up because I think it's relevant with the public distrust, a mechanism that might form anyway. Is there any resources or anything you'd like to shout out that you think is beneficial or of interest to you that someone should go search or research, any papers of yours or books that you like or anything that delves more into the topics we talked about?
You know what, I'm not going to promote my own work, which is available. I have a website if anyone's interested to see my work, with all the papers linked, mayagoldenberg.ca. See, easy. But I'll tell you what I'm reading this summer, because this is, well, it's May now, it's not exactly summer, but this is when classes end for the April term, and professors like me get to read and research from May until, let's say, end of July. So this is our big research time. So that's exciting. And I am continuously coming back to the philosophy and sociology of expertise, because I'm so interested in these questions about how the public responds to expert claims. And it is, of course, mediated by the experts who say them. A lot of the kind of scientific claims are very niche, very high level. Unless you work in the field, you're not going to have a very good understanding of it. And that's not because we're stupid, it's just because we don't have the training to really know all the ins and outs of something like a vaccine. We just know generally if it works or not. And even that information is probably mediated from a book we read, a blog, or something like that. So I'm interested in questions about who are the experts, why are they trusted, and what role do they play in democratic societies like ours. So I have a list of some books I wanted to check out this summer. I haven't read them, but they look very promising. And one of them is called Politics and Expertise: How to Use Science in a Democratic Society. And it's by a sociologist named Zeynep Pamuk, Pamuk. And it's gotten some good press, and I think it might be an interesting book and maybe something that I could teach at some of my classes. Another one that I plan to read is so that one's a more recent book, but this one from 2002, it's called Trust Us, We're Experts, and it's by Hampton and Stauber. And the last one on my list is called Science and Democracy, Controversies and Conflicts. And it addresses, among other things, questions of expertise. But that's some of the reading I'd like to do this summer, and I'm pretty excited. I think it's going to be good stuff.
Thank you for doing this episode. Thank you so much.